protecting the country, there's going to be a change, right? And especially with new ideas like nationalism and social Darwinism, there's going to be this idea of identity, Chinese identity being understood biologically. What is it to be Chinese? That is a biological category. Right? To be Chinese is a biological category. And there's this question about what will China's place be as a race, right? Remember we had this funny comic where this woman says, everything I have is modern except for your yellow face, right? And they talked about in color terms, right? That there was this understanding that there is a competition among different races, right? So we talk about this guy Yan Fu who's bringing in these new Western ideas, and he brings in the idea of social Darwinism, right? He'll translate books on social Darwinism, this idea of applying the struggle between different species to different human races, and say different human races are in conflict and in competition with each other, right? And there's different ways you can divide this, but it seems that the predominant one in Asia was by color terms, right? They would often do this in terms of five. There's the reds, the whites, the yellows, the blacks, and the browns. Those are the five major categories. And he had this, Yan Fu raised this question, he means whites, will enslave us and hinder the development of our spirit and body. The brown and black races constantly labor between life and death. Why not the 400 million yellows? So they look at what happened to Native Americans, they look at what happened to Indians, they look at what happened to Africans, and they said, well, this happened to us too. Right? Well, this happened to us too. And this helps lead to a shift away from the Qing dynasty, right? Because the Qing are a different race, in a sense. I know it's complex. You may say, aren't they yellow? And it's like, well, it's tricky, the way people apply these ideas. It's very complex. But also, remember, we talked about how the radical ideas coming in as well, things like anarchism, socialism, Marxism. We'll talk a lot about communism next section, feminism. And what's striking is how, I gave the example of this woman, Dingling, who we'll talk about later, this female author. She will write a book or a short story called The Diary of Miss Sophie. And it's named after Sophia Perovskaya, who helped assassinate Alexander II. Right, so this is pretty radical stuff. We ended talking about this guy Zhou, and it was he's this guy, he writes a book called The Revolutionary Army, calling for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. He's arrested and thrown in jail. He dies in prison. And it's interesting because he's a nationalist, right? And he has this idea, all people, men and women, all Chinese people, have rights to be protected by the government, so it sounds like liberal democracy. They should help choose their governments, democracy, right? And all people should actively serve the state, right? So he has nationalism. So these very modern ideas. But I remember Chris had brought this question, well, do Manchus get the right to vote? And it's like, no, Manchus don't even get the right to stay in China, right? Theirs is and I want to stress this, where did that go? Their land is a foul land. They need to go back. These foul people need to go back to their foul land. And I want you to keep that in mind, this idea of territory. We'll come back to that shortly. So, remember we talked about he had these anti-Manchu ideas as well. And I want to stress that these ideas don't just stay with men. Women become increasingly politically active. Right? We talked about this woman, Chu Jin, who's a feminist and a nationalist. And what's interesting, she engaged in cross-dressing. And this seems to have been in part to assert that even though she was a woman, she could be part of political discussions, like any man could be. Now she will be executed because she will take part in an uprising which in part plotted to kill a Manchu governor. And I want to stress, she's holding a knife there. So you can see how gender is changing a bit in China, right? This is not a traditional Chinese woman. Interestingly enough, if a traditional Chinese woman had a knife and was supposed to use it, she'd be using it on herself to protect her chastity, right? But she's going to be pointing that knife outward, right? And I don't know if Chinese women did this in Korea. Elite women would often carry knives, and that was why, was that if they were in danger, they could kill themselves. So that brings us to Sun Yat-sen. And the thing I want to say about Sun Yat-sen is, whereas Chu Jin, unfortunately for her, was killed, right? She was executed, she was only 32. Sun Yat-sen is the ultimate survivor. He will launch something like 12 coups or rebellions against the Qing dynasty, and they can never get this guy. They totally want to kill this guy, they can't get him. Right? This guy's the ultimate survivor. Right? He's the ultimate survivor. He even gets kidnapped for a time in Britain. The Qing actually send agents while he's in Britain to kidnap him, but the British find out about it and are really upset that they would, violate their territory by kidnapping him. Right? So, now, one thing I want to emphasize about Sun Yat-sen, I have a clip I'm going to play for you. It's a little bit longer than what I usually like to do, but this guy's really important. And one thing I want to stress, just to give you an idea of how important it is, there's going to be, we'll talk later about the conflict between the communists and the nationalists. And you may know that, there's the People's Republic of China, right? There's also the island of Taiwan, which is governed by what's called the Republic of China, right? That's the official name of their government. And both of them, even though they're at odds, and even though we'll talk about how the communists and nationalists will struggle, both respect Sun Yat-sen, right? So even though the communists and nationalists like disagree on everything, this guy they respect, both of them. So we need to look at him in detail. He tells us a lot about how things are working. So I don't have a particular question as I play this. I just want you to watch it and see who this Sun Yat-sen guy is, and then I'll come in and kind of fill in some things that are important.
Honolulu, Hawaii, 1879. Sun Yat-sen would have many names in his life. All Chinese men did then. He'd have his genealogical name, his baptism name, his courtesy name, but he would also have others. Names with false passports to back them up. Names he'd use in hiding. Because Sun was a dangerous man. The Qing were right to fear him. After all, he'd bring 2,000 years of imperial rule crashing down. But in 1879, he was just Sun Wen, a student in Hawaii, one of 7 Chinese at his largely Hawaiian Anglican boarding school. He'd been born in southern China, the son of poor peasants, at a time when there was little opportunity for boys like him. His family were not scholars who could get him a government position. The stagnant economy promised no upward mobility. Instability ruled back home. The largest revolt in centuries, the Taiping Rebellion, had ended only 2 years before his birth. Ever since the British took Hong Kong in the Opium Wars, foreign countries were scrambling for larger and larger chunks of Chinese territory. Now, they were flooding the market with cheap manufactured goods, putting Chinese artisans out of work. Foreign steamships sailed up the rivers, bringing in goods and bringing out coal. Opium still ravaged the country. Imperial attempts at modernization inevitably failed due to mismanagement and corruption. Even when the government did adopt new technologies, like steamships, they had to finance them through foreign capital and hire foreign engineers. And yet the Qing government, a northern ethnic minority perceived as foreign occupiers, kept insisting on the supremacy of their culture and deciding there was no need for change. Many Chinese had gone overseas. In fact, Sun's own brother went to the Kingdom of Hawaii to work in the sugarcane fields, and Sun saved up for a shop and ranch. Sun and his mother followed him. The schools were better, that was sure. At least they were for lucky kids with brothers who made enough to pay the tuition. Here, unlike his village school, he got an education that opened the world. He picked up English fast. So fast that he was soon writing for the school newspaper, and received an award from the king. But that wasn't all. He learned about British and American legal systems, constitutional government, democracy, and Western history, with an emphasis on the American Revolution, Glorious Revolution, and unification of Germany and Italy. When he graduated, he moved on to college-level courses at a missionary school. Here, the curriculum was more specifically American, imbued with a particular brand of New World optimism and dogma of self-betterment. But it also exposed him to Protestantism. And when he came home one day, asking permission to be baptized, his brother figured enough was enough. He sent Sun home. But those years in Hawaii had changed the 17-year-old Sun. He now saw his village as backwards and superstitious, and tried to fix that by tearing down one of the gods at the local temple. The act got him banished, and there was only one place for him to go. Hong Kong, 1883. Hong Kong was something totally different from Honolulu. This was a true city, a little Victorian England in the middle of Asia. Technology, banking, modern transportation, clean streets, and massive buildings. The contrast between his poor village and this metropolis laid bare to him how foolish the Qing had been not to modernize. He was only 50 miles from home. The next few years were a blur. He enrolled in college, got married, his parents arranged it, and was baptized a Christian. Sun decided he wanted to help people, so he got a medical degree. But Hong Kong didn't recognize his degree. So he opened a pharmacy in Macau, and later Guangzhou, earning a reputation for giving away free medicine. But medicine wasn't his only pursuit. He developed a group of friends in Hong Kong, middle-class professionals like him who loved to talk politics. Several had connections with anti-Qing societies, and they began talking openly about overthrowing the emperor and replacing him with a democracy. theoretically at first, then in specifics. The group became so notorious for their radical talk, people nicknamed them the Four Desperados. And as they talked, the century of humiliation marched on. The Qing lost Korea to the Japanese, and Vietnam to France. Western countries were building railways through the country, with corridors along the tracks where Chinese law didn't apply. The Empress Dowager increasingly pulled strings of government. More Chinese territory got ceded to foreign control. Everyone from Germany to Italy to Belgium was taking a piece. But there was an undercurrent of hope. In 1884, he'd seen Hong Kong dock workers refuse to repair a French warship damaged while fighting Chinese forces. And he met men in Hong Kong who believed it was possible to reform the Qing state. He found their arguments persuasive and decided to offer his ideas directly to the government. In 1894, he traveled to Beijing, both to see the capital and to file a petition with his recommendations for reforming agriculture, opening free trade, and leveraging China's human skill. He tried to deliver the letter to a government official known as a champion of reform. The man refused to see him. This rejection incensed Sun, but it was more than that. The wealth he saw displayed in Beijing, the open corruption, drove every thought of reform from his mind. The ineffectual Qing must be overthrown, and he knew just where to start. Honolulu. 20 men crowd into a 2-story wooden house. Dr. Sun is there, along with his brother. They all know what this gathering is about. This is the first meeting of the Revived China Society, a secret revolutionary organization dedicated to overthrowing the Qing. I'm a doctor, says Sun, but before treating my patients, I must first cure my country. But to do that, he would need money. This overseas chapter will primarily be a fundraising organization. His brother had agreed to sell some of his property to help the fight. Could he count on these men? Turns out, he could. Some sold businesses. Others gave what they could or organized fundraising events. Sun's electric speeches began attracting crowds in Honolulu's Chinatown. There were 5,000 Chinese in Hawaii, he'd say. If each person gave him $1, that would be $5,000 towards the revolution. A few would give more than that, volunteering to come back and fight when the time came. It came sooner than anyone thought. China had fared badly in the Sino-Japanese War, suffering a series of embarrassing naval defeats that had once again exposed the corruption and incompetence of the Qing. The time was right. 3 months after founding the Revived China Society in Honolulu, Sun returned to Hong Kong to establish its global headquarters. But this Revived China Society, disguised as a social club, was more than a fundraising group. Renewing contacts from his college years, he met up with Young Kuan, founder of a literary society that was, like his social club, actually a revolutionary group. Unlike Sun, Young had deep contacts in Hong Kong, and with the anti-Qing secret societies that operated in southern China. He'd been cultivating them for a revolt and acquiring weapons for 3 years. Some of these secret societies were the infamous triads, who in their centuries of anti-Qing resistance frequently turned to organized crime. Sun, ever pragmatic, turned a blind eye. The two groups merged, appointing Young chairman of the Revived China Society, and taking a pledge to expel the Qing, restore Chinese rule, and establish a federal republic. They greenlit the uprising. Sun's longtime friend, Liu Haotong, made them a flag to fight under. A white sun on a blue sky. It was time to rise. With the war ending, thousands of discharged soldiers were milling around Guangzhou, also known as Canton. Angry, defeated, and frequently unpaid, they were joining triad groups and revolutionary societies in steady numbers. If Sun and his comrades could start an uprising, they reasoned the people would join them. They recruited 3,000 triads. When activated, they'd assemble in Hong Kong and catch a ferry to Guangzhou. Then they'd break into units to hit their designated targets. Some would seize government offices or bottle up troops and police. Others would capture or kill local officials. Sun quietly moved to Guangzhou, presenting himself as a head of an agricultural society to explain the strange coming and goings. He set up a religious bookshop as a front. There were spiritual pamphlets out front and an arms cache in the back. Contacts in Hong Kong shipped him loads of revolvers hidden in barrels labeled cement. Triads surveilled government buildings and shadowed targets. And they chose a date, October 26th, a festival day where busy street celebrations could provide cover as the strike force got into position. It was an auspicious date, the 9th day of the 9th lunar month. Yet it would all go so wrong.
All right. So one thing I just want to point out before I go over that, there was an error. They said that China lost Korea to Japan. Korea was never China's to lose. Korea belongs to Korea. Daehan Dongnet Mansei, right? Korean independence for 10,000 years. So Sun Yat-sen, he's an interesting guy, right? He's someone we would call a marginal intellectual in a sense, right? He's a smart guy. But he's on the margins of society. His family has enough money to get him some education, but not enough money to make him rise in society. It's very important to understand that because that's the kind of person who becomes revolutionary. They're smart enough that they can think in terms of a revolution, but they don't benefit from the old order. Right? If he would have been given a government position, he probably would have been pro-government. But he's excluded from that. So because of that, because they don't have much money, he's going to study abroad. Right? He'll study in Honolulu. He's going to study in Hong Kong. He'll go to missionary schools and things like that. And he's especially inspired by what he sees in those places, in Hong Kong, in Hawaii, and all these other different places that he travels around. He has this idea that maybe we can be more like the West. And there's some really good ideas. The West has some really good political ideas, like democracy and stuff like that. And of course, if you've been excluded from power, and democracy promises to share power, you're going to support democracy. Now, he will bring his ideas for reform to the government, and the government will reject them. And so he becomes revolutionary. Oh, you're not going to listen to me? You don't want change? We're going to get rid of you guys. So he's going to move from becoming a reformer to revolutionary. Now, his ideas are interesting. As they mentioned there, he's a convert to Christianity. And I have to stress, remember, they made a big deal about him being a Protestant Christian, and that's very important because, I mean, it's generally true anyway, but being a Protestant Christian in particular was not just about believing certain things about Jesus. It was a belief also that believing those things about Jesus led you to embrace democracy and capitalism and all these other things that make you strong. If you talk to, especially to a religious person, even someone not so religious from America or Britain at the time, you said, why is your country so strong? You'd say, well, we're a Protestant nation. Never mind, there's some Catholics there. They'd say, well, we're a Protestant nation. That's what made us so strong, because this connection between liberty, power, and religion. So he will embrace not just Christianity as a religion in terms of doctrine, but also he believes it comes with the ideas of democracy and nationalism. Now he will become an important exile leader, right? He'll spend a lot of his time outside of China, working with overseas Chinese in places like Indonesia, Malaysia, United States. And he will be raising funds, raising money to have a revolution, right? So he can buy the guns, buy the cement, and all the other things, right, that you need to launch a revolution. And he will actually form something called the Revolutionary Alliance for this purpose. And he will constantly attempt to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And here you can see again this clash, right? Remember we brought up at the beginning of this section, who are we? Who are we Chinese? What do we reform? How much do we reform? Kang Youwei is still around, but he thinks that China will benefit by being ruled by the Qing. He wants to keep the Qing around. Sun Yat-sen thinks that's bad for China. He thinks the Qing need to go. That's what will fix China. Now here's something that's very important, and there's a tension here, and this goes again to this question of who are we Chinese? This is what Sun wrote about race and about Chinese nationality. Considering the law of survival of ancient modern races, notice he's influenced by social Darwinism. He's afraid that something's going to happen to the Chinese race when you have these competitions between races. If we want to save China and to preserve the Chinese race, we must certainly promote nationalism, right? This idea that each nation should have its own state, that Han Chinese should be ruled by Han Chinese, right? Chinese should be ruled by Chinese. That's the basic idea. Foreigners should not rule us, we should rule ourselves. To make this principle luminous for China's salvation, we must first understand it clearly. The Chinese race totals 400 million people. Of mingled races, there are only a few million Mongolians, a million or so Manchus, a few million Tibetans, and over a million Mohammedan, old word for Muslim, Turks. Right? These alien races do not number altogether more than 10 million, so that for the most part, the Chinese people are of the Han or Chinese race with common blood, common language, common religion, and common customs, a single pure race. So there's this idea, we Chinese, we Han Chinese are a pure race, but we've got these other people who kind of live around us. How do they fit in? Now Zhou Rong thought they should just leave, right? At least he thought the Manchu should just leave, right? Zhou Rong's like, go back to your foul land. But when the Republic of China is established, these are the borders it claims. It includes Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, where at the time, the majority of people were not Han Chinese people. So there's a tension within Chinese identity. What does it mean to be Chinese? If all this is China, shouldn't Tibetans also be Chinese? And should people from Xinjiang also be Chinese? And should people from Mongolia also be Chinese? That currently is the law in China. Those people are considered Chinese. And one reason they're in very geographically and strategically important areas. So people like Sun Yat-sen wanted these areas, but they weren't quite sure what to do with the people in them, who at the time formed the majority. I think now in Xinjiang and Tibet, the majority are not those people, the majority are Han Chinese. At this time, the majority in Manchuria were Han Chinese, by the way. Even in Manchuria, the predominant group of people were Han. But you can see this tension. And what will end up happening is there's this kind of identity. We're Chinese, we're all Chinese, but the Han are the most Chinese. And that, again, creates a kind of tension here. And like I said, if you follow the principle of nationalism, these things should all be independent. That's what Zhou Rong seemed to think, right? Zhou Rong thought Manchuria should be separate from China. We'll talk more later why they want to hold on to Manchuria. But you can see my major point here is I just want to emphasize this tension about who are we. Does being Chinese include people from Tibet who speak a different language, follow a different religion, and so forth? And that wouldn't be a big issue, but the territory is very important, so they want to keep a hold of it. And notice this is what the Qing Empire looked like. So there's again this curious tension where Sun Yat-sen and other Han nationalists didn't want to be ruled by foreigners, the Manchus, but they wanted to rule Manchuria. Right? It's a tension, it's a complex issue they have to deal with, and that, in a sense, China is still dealing with, and that will help you kind of understand the news today. So a few announcements. We might start section 6 today. I'll talk more about this later. It's more likely going to be Friday. I apologize, that's kind of off. I'll explain why in a second. Review quiz will open Friday and close Sunday. The reading quiz opens today after class and closes Sunday. I do want to mention a little bit about the readings. So there's 3 readings. These 2 are very short, only a couple pages. This is a little bit longer, but it's mostly pictures. So don't be freaked out when you look at it. But Essentials of the New Life movement, this is a movement that started in the 1930s. It's kind of an attempt at modernizing Confucianism to reform the Chinese people. So remember how in AQ, the story of AQ, we talked about how there's this need to reform Chinese culture deeply because there's all these problems? This is an attempt to do that. How do we get people to stop being AQs? That's what this is trying to do. It's the nationalists, right? Sun Yat-sen's party. Sun Yat-sen is the founder of the nationalists. It's what they're trying to do, though Sun Yat-sen is dead by this time. The second reading is called China's Modern Sketch. It's a comic magazine that was released in 1934. So it's a bunch of comics. A lot of them are political cartoons, and that's why that's included. So it's a little bit longer, but it's actually if you look at the actual number of words, it's short. But there's a lot of really cool comics that Chinese people were drawing in 1934. So that's why I like to include that, because I think it's interesting to kind of see how they understood their situation and how they're combining traditional Chinese and modern Western ways of art. The last is a book called it's a short article called How to Be a Good Communist. And it was written in like 1939, and it's trying to explain in a simple way what communism is. Communism is an extraordinarily deep ideology. It's very complex. This was an attempt to make it simple. It's written by a man named Liu Shaoqi. Was I even close on the pronunciation? Liu Shaoqi? Thank you. It was written by him. We'll talk more about him later, right? He'll show up a lot. Tianyu, do people still read this? Is this like normal reading in China?
No.
Not so much anymore?
Not now.
Okay, I was curious. It was wildly popular, I think in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah.
But okay, not anymore. I just was curious because it was interesting. Sometimes you'll notice this shows how things are different, how we teach this. Sometimes Tianyu is like, I know that guy. Yeah, we totally talk about him. And other times he's like, who? And that shows how we teach this differently, right? It shows how we approach this differently. Okay, so I apologize. We're probably not going to get section today. I have a good reason. One thing I should point out, historians were always saying, history will help you understand the present better. And we're always saying that, but we oftentimes don't explain how. And there's two events that happened recently in China that I think illustrate that perfectly. And by bringing up the present, I hopefully can help you understand the past better and how that past impacts the present. So this is something I put together in just the last day because of events that have occurred in China. So please bear with me. This will take hopefully only like 10 minutes, but it is important if we want to understand this information. Other things. So first of all, you may remember Annie, right? Some of you know Annie, some of you don't, but we keep talking about this young lady, Annie. And she was so excited because October 1st is National Day. 70 years ago, from October 1st, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, right? 1949, October 1st. And there's all these big events. It's kind of like 4th of July, in a sense. There's all these big events to celebrate it. And my understanding, Tenyu and the other Chinese students got together to watch the live feed, because they have these wonderful kind of events and ceremonies. So Amy sent me, I think, 5 or 6 emails with like 7 or 8 videos that she wanted me to share with you. Thank you, Annie. I hope you're listening to this, or will be listening to this. It's not a live feed. So I did promise I want to show at least one. This is only a minute long, but she took this of the TV. She was so excited. She kept sending me these. So I just want to show you this just to give a sense of what we're talking about. So this is Tiananmen, right? Tiananmen Square? Yeah. So it's center of Beijing. Those are like people holding like poster cards that they can flip around to make different shapes. Yeah, she's filming off. That's Annie's room, I guess. So I showed that, and now, Tenyu, I ask you what, and we're going to watch another clip that I took from a news service. But first of all, Tenyu and I were discussing this beforehand. So Tenyu, you watched National Day celebrations. How did it make you feel? Talk about.
I think our country become more stronger, and I think although we still have some problems like Hong Kong problems, but nowadays, because we never forget our humiliation, and I think nowadays we can protect our territory.
Excellent, excellent. So just to make it, initially, I just want to add something because you said at the beginning of class it's made you feel proud.
Yes.
It made you feel proud because now we're strong. Right? We're strong and we can protect our territory. We may have some problems, but overall, this is a much better situation than what we went through previously. Right? And one thing I want to stress, we've been talking about problems so far in China. It gets worse. Right? We're not even done yet talking about China's problems. It's going to get much, much worse. And sadly, a lot more Chinese people we're going to watch die in this class. Like it's terrible. So I want to point that excellent. So that was Tianyu's impression. I'm going to play a clip now that I think will go along with what you just said. Right? So this is just a news report that gives you like a 3-minute summary of the National Day celebrations. And just watch it, kind of pick up on what Tianyu said, and then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about it. Lander colors. That's the president, Xi Jinping. He stayed in the United States, and after he became president, he visited his host family, which would be really weird.
前进征程上，我们要坚持和平统一、一国两制的方针，保持香港、澳门长期繁荣稳定，
It's the, I think, is that Lamb?
推动
Hong Kong.
海
Yeah,
峡
yeah.
两岸关系和平发展，团结全体中华儿女，继续为实现祖国完全统一而奋斗。
All right. So, like I say, if we want to understand, I'm trying to figure out how to continue this. Like I said, it's just. So, Tanya, what was that video clip? Was that a fairly good summary, or is there something you would add?
It's
Or-
good, but it also has some over 100,000 people in the parade. Means they are ordinary person.
Right. Yeah, and I don't, I mean, if you watch this very carefully, this is somewhat negative toward, this is a little bit negative coverage. Right, so they focus on the military, they didn't mention, like you said, they mentioned the 15,000 troops, not the 100,000 civilians, right? But again, if we want to, there is this idea, we want to present a strong China, right? Both in terms, I think, for political reasons today, right? You want people to take your country seriously, you have to present a strong image. But also this idea that, hey, we suffered a lot. Like Tianyu said, this makes us proud to see our military. And it's just interesting because we were talking about this before, and this shows kind of a difference in our understanding of the world, because as time with Dai, the United States and Korea typically did not do this. Park Chung-hee did it in the 1960s and 70s, and Dai said, well, yes, he was a dictator. So there's a different understanding of kind of political systems here and what you should do, right? I'm kind of uncomfortable with the idea, right? I think it's the first time ever, right? We had a military at the 4th of July this last summer, which seemed very curious to me. I don't want to be too political in class, but that's not something we generally do. And I like to point back to the Roman Empire. In Rome, armies were not supposed to come into the city. They weren't supposed to come in the capital. When they did, Caesar overthrew the Republic. So it's a different political understanding, right? So my point is that from what a Chinese perspective, this is very positive. For many Western people, this is maybe not so much. And I think it was really striking, like, do they make sure everyone's the same height? Like, I'm not trying to, like, the Chinese soldiers were like all the same height, right? Did you notice that when they were in ranks?
Yeah.
Like, American soldiers were like all over the place, right?
No, we
They
not.
choose
What's that, say, armor?
No, we not.
Same height? Oh, they're not?
No, we not all over the place. It just depends.
No, I'm not criticizing the American military. What I mean is that American soldiers are different heights.
Oh, yeah.
Like when you form a row, right? When you form, no, I'm not criticizing the American army. No, my point, no, sorry, I'm not criticizing. What I mean though is when you line up, right, there's these guys that are different heights, right? Men and women, different heights. And I thought it was interesting, right? Everything was very disciplined, very orderly. And that presents an image that if you're from a Western political view, may make you a little uncomfortable, at least it did me. But that's kind of the idea. So I wanted to highlight that because I think it will help you understand when we talk about the military and China's problems, you'll connect it to the present. Here's the other issue that I want to mention that comes up with this, because I think China is entering a very serious crossroads, right? China is, in a sense, you could say, at a crossroads. There's some very serious things going on that China has to figure out how to navigate. So this is a National Day picture. This is in Hong Kong, right? This is a National Day picture in Hong Kong. These are pro-government Hong Kong people, right? So they're flying the People's Republic of China flag. These are anti, and they're burning not the People's Republic flag, they're burning the Communist flag, right? That's the flag of the Communist Party. So this is going on while National Day is going on. So there is a division, in a sense, among Chinese people, at least in Hong Kong, right, about what direction the country should go, right? And as they think about the history, this is impacting how they understand things, right? So I want to play for you another clip, and this is a little, they said it's graphic, I don't think it's particularly graphic. This is an attempt to show what's going on in Hong Kong at the same time as you have this celebration, right? This is something that just happened on National Day, so just a bit ago.
We break down the incident into 4 distinct phases. The video starts with a group of protesters moving forward cautiously. Many are wearing helmets and masks. They're carrying umbrellas,
This is Hong Kong?
poles, and at least one of them is holding a hammer. Initially, they move slowly around the corner of a building. It appears they are looking for something or someone. Phase 2 begins when the protesters' target comes into view. It's a police officer wearing riot gear. He's carrying a large shield. He is alone at this point. The situation quickly escalates as the protesters rush towards him. The police officer is running backwards, and moments later, he trips and falls to the ground. The protesters surround the police officer and beat him. Phase 3, other police officers charge in. A protester carrying a blue shield attempts to attack an officer. That officer then shoots him with his revolver at point-blank range. The start of Phase 4 is marked by protesters dispersing quickly. A protester in a yellow helmet attempts to help the protester who was shot. He is immediately tackled. We then see a Molotov cocktail thrown at the police officers. In a separate video, one of the first that appeared online about this incident, the shot protester is seen bleeding around his chest. He says his chest is hurting and he needs to go to the hospital.
All right. So my point of this, right, is
Just to add, that kid is now in critical condition at the hospital.
I thought he was okay though. Is he critical and stable?
Last I checked, that was last night.
Okay, I think that's what I heard too.
What is umbrella? That's like a sword, the umbrella.
So my point of this is, I mean, this is not a class on current events in China. So my point is not to give you, the paint this kind of right, what's going on here in a sense. My point was to emphasize how China's at a crossroads, right? We're talking about Chinese history and different Chinese people remembering that history differently. So some Chinese people are looking back and saying, we had this century of humiliation, and that's been overcome by the Communist Party. There is no new China without the Communist Party. That's a very important slogan, right? There is no new China without the Communist Party. And then you have other people who are saying, no, we don't like that. We want to look to a different tradition, a different kind of history. And you can see that literally those different understandings of history and how things should operate is leading to violence. I'm not a specialist in these areas, but it's hard for me to think of a way of resolving this situation peacefully, and it's my hope that it will be resolved in a way that everyone can live with. But it's a difficult situation. My hope is as we talk about these things in this class, you can understand this better, right? And understand why what we're talking about is very, very important, right? Because now it's impacting things. Of course, it impacts the U.S. government because the American officials have spoken out on this, and Beijing has not been happy, I think, with what the Americans have said. Right? So it's a very complex issue. To understand it better, I think we have to look at stuff like that. And it's taken on new. Now if you look at the YouTube comments, some people are like, well, yeah, if you try and beat up a police officer, you shouldn't be surprised if you get shot. Other people say it doesn't matter, that is a citizen, police officers should not shoot citizens like that. So there's a debate about whether this is right or wrong. But this has led to more protests by average people, right? They say this should not happen. What is this, a war zone? So it's complex, right? And this is an ongoing situation. Okay. And notice we talk about the army now, and that's why I wanted to take a break, right? To talk about these things now, because now we're talking about the army. Because remember, pretty much everyone in China agreed the army needed to be reformed. Like that was one thing. They're like, we keep losing wars. We need to fix the army, right? We need to fix the army. So there's attempts to modernize the army. This is going to work really well. In fact, it works too well. Because many people in the army are going to adopt very radical ideas. I'm going to turn off the light so you can see this picture better. Many are going to adopt modern ideas, particularly radical nationalism. And do you want to bet that Sun Yat-sen sent a bunch of agents to spread his ideas in the army? Right, so Sun Yat-sen, remember how he had pamphlets and things like that? He would spread those out, and he would have agents trying to gain the support of new army officers. Right, so the Qing are modernizing their army because they want a strong army. That exposes the soldiers to modern radical ideas, and Sun Yat-sen will have increasing influence. Those guys are going to listen to Sun. And one thing is going to happen is that many soldiers are going to say, who cares about the Qing? We're just waiting for a time to overthrow them. And many will be, even if they aren't that political, they're going to be more loyal to their commanders than to the Qing. Right, there's this issue of personal loyalty. right? Many soldiers will develop a loyalty not to the Qing, which doesn't pay them, but to the local regional commanders who do. Right? Keep that in mind. Soldiers tend to be loyal. No offense, Army. Soldiers tend to be loyal to whoever pays them, right? In history. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe these soldiers can be more loyal to the commanders than to the Qing. And to give you a sense of how radical this gets, notice these soldiers. They're missing something, aren't they? They don't have their cues. They cut off their pigtails. Right? That's a sign of whose side you're on. Now, this was a big deal because there was complaints among the soldiers that, oh, these things are hard. It's hard to have a modern military wearing these things. So they got permission to do this. But that's a big deal, right? That was a major sign that you would accept a Qing rule, and now the army doesn't have to follow that rule, or that there. So this is very dangerous. The other thing, and this is what's astounding, I think is really interesting about the Chinese Revolution, the 1911 Revolution essentially started because of railways. Railroads, that's why it started. Railways are very important. They allow you to move troops very quickly. They allow you to move resources. You can bring in raw materials, you can make them into something, and then you can export them. And so there's this expansion of railways because they're so important. They want to build more and more railways. But there's an argument in China about how to do this. The Qing want foreign investment to get the money, right? You need money to build railways. The Qing want foreign investment, and they want central control. The Qing want to control the railways, and they want to fund them by getting foreign loans. Nationalist Chinese want local control. They don't want the central government controlling it. They want to control it themselves, and they oppose foreign investment. When you loan money, in a sense, you become a slave to the person when you borrow money, that gives you power over the people. When you borrow money, the people who you borrowed it from have power over you, right? We don't want to give those foreigners any more power over us. We need to raise the money ourselves. The army is particularly concerned with this because railroads are extraordinarily important to defend your country because you need to move troops quickly whenever there's a problem. In a city called Chengdu, located right here, Chengdu, they're going to start raising money for to build a railroad through local means, like local bonds. They're going to have local fundraisers and things to build their own railway. And they get started, and then the Qing come in and say, oh, we're taking over. We're taking your railway. We're going to build it now. And they plan to finish it using foreign loans. So the people of Chengdu who have been working on this railway are not happy at all about this. Moreover, when the Qing buy them out, right, they raised money and started building the railway, the Qing don't give them money, they give them government bonds, which aren't worth a lot. So they basically feel like they have had their railway stolen from them. This will lead to massive protests by the locals, and these protests will be ignored. In fact, the Qing actually sent in a military commander loyal to the Qing, who's known as like a butcher, known as like a guy that just goes in and slaughters people. So this makes them really angry, so they form the railway protection movement, and they start protesting, and eventually the Qing will try and crush this, and this leads to actual fighting. So people will start shooting each other. So we have the beginnings of a revolution over railways. This will lead to more risings throughout the country. Once the ball gets rolling, it's just going to keep rolling. All these different people are going to rise up throughout the country. Right? There's going to be massacres, particularly of Manchu. Right? This is a serious war in a sense. There's a lot of conflict. Many people have read Zhou and they want to get rid of the Manchu, so lots of Manchus, when they lose, will be massacred. So this is very serious. The Manchu will also massacre their opponents, by the way. So it's kind of equal opportunity. What was going to happen is numerous provinces, especially in the south, will secede from the Qing Empire and form the Republic of China. Right, so you're going to have all these different people, provinces are going to secede from the empire and then form into the Republic of China, and they will elect Sun Yat-sen president. Right, they will elect Sun Yat-sen president. What's really striking is that Sun Yat-sen was in Colorado when he was elected president. He found out he was president of China by reading a newspaper. Like, he read in the newspaper, Sun Yat-sen has been elected president of China. Kind of interesting thing. Good reason to read the newspaper. You never know what you'll be elected to be. So we will stop there. We will pick up with this, finish it up finally. I apologize for the delay. I thought that was important stuff you should know about, think about. Will help you better understand this history. We'll pick up with section 6 on Friday. I'm going to finish section 5 and start section 6 on Friday.
Dr. Rouse, did Sun Yat-sen ever come back to China?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. No, he's going to come to China. He'll be hanging around in China a lot.